But don't forget, I'm a strict Catholic. I agree with that senatorium. Says if we let this stuff go too far, pretty soon we'll be fucking dogs.
In the course of just 25 years, Clovis, the first of the Merovingians, united the Frankish people, adopted Roman Christianity, and laid the foundations for a kingdom that would last 2.5 centuries. By the time of his death at age 45 in the early 6th century AD, Clovis's legacy was secure. As the old Frankish tongue gave way to French, the name Clovis became Louis, making him the namesake to 18 different kings of France. One could make the argument that Clovis was the most effective and memorable Frankish ruler until Charlemagne himself. And yet, none of these things changed the fact that Clovis was a thug that God had chosen to perform his miracles. That is, more or less, how the bishop and historian Gregory of Tours, our narrator for much of this period, would put it, though perhaps not in those exact words. To our pious but practical narrator, it was clear that God's will could be enacted even by the most vicious of his servants, one who cheated, lied, murdered, and betrayed everyone around him, spilling the blood of foes, friends, and family members alike. The thing is, Clovis had done all of this in pursuit of victory. And since victory for Clovis meant victory for Roman Catholicism, this barbarian king would not be remembered as a bloody Attila, Alaric, or Genghis Khan. It is almost as if the blood on Clovis's hands would transubstantiate into the fruit of Christendom in a reversal of the Eucharist limited to Christ's royal followers. It was not for kings to be entirely innocent. Kings could break the rules set down for others, because ruling was a hard business, especially in the Dark Ages. A king simply could not be expected to act like a saint, and as we shall see, the saints of this era were not entirely innocent either. When Clovis died, he left behind 4 sons to whom he equally partitioned his kingdom, roughly corresponding to the region of modern France. This would be a mistake, and it was only a matter of time before Clovis's sons were at one another's throats. But because an open confrontation would probably not sit well with their followers, the sons of Clovis resorted to schemes, plots, and conquests of surrounding territory, all in the hope of gaining the upper hand against one another and thereby reuniting Francia under one ruler. The eldest of Clovis's sons, Theuderic, ruled the northern part of the kingdom from the city of Metz. The next son, Clodomir, ruled southwest of him in Orleans. Childebert ruled a region sandwiched between them in Paris, and the youngest, Clotaire, who would outlast all of them, ruled northeast of Paris in Soissons. Clovis's famed widow, Clotilde, was mother to the younger 3, while the eldest son, Theuderic, was born by one of Clovis's earlier wives or concubines, the distinction still not being clear in those days. Clovis's eldest son, Theuderic, already had a capable and martially inclined son of his own, Theudebert, of whom we will hear more shortly. At varying times, The four sons of Clovis were at odds with the neighboring Thuringians, Burgundians, Visigoths, and other wandering barbarian peoples now settled, enacting their own bloody dramas as they carved up their realms, which orbited the fractured Frankish kingdom like so many doomed planets with alien inhabitants clinging to alien ways. Although the Burgundians had embraced Catholicism, the roots of their conflict with the Franks ran deep, nourished on the sort of blood feud that serves to remind us of the not-so-distant pagan past. Clovis's widow, Clotilde, a Burgundian princess who hailed from that southeastern land, accused the ruling branch of the family of murdering her parents. To avenge her mother and father, she urged her sons to make war. But in doing so, she unknowingly occasioned the death of her son, Clodomir, who would die in the fighting that ensued. Although their first campaign in Burgundy seems to have been reasonably successful, the second one was a disaster. We are told that the Burgundians lured Clotilde's son, Clodomir, toward their ranks by imitating the war cry of his army, before surrounding him, hacking off his head, and impaling it on a stake that they paraded around the battlefield. Despite presenting a unified front, the Merovingians were forced to retire and lick their wounds. 3 brothers now remained: Clotaire, the youngest, Childebert, the middle child, and Theuderic, the oldest, all of whom seem to have taken part in this second campaign. This is curious, because Theuderic was half-brother to the other sons of Clovis. Clotilde was not Theuderic's mother, and yet this war had been waged on the pretext of avenging her parents. The key word here is pretext, as it belies more practical considerations for waging war during this time, namely, the acquisition of land and plunder. So long as a Merovingian king could provide those two things, land and plunder, he was golden. Failing that, he risked losing face in front of his people, who at this point in time can still more accurately be described as followers rather than subjects, their loyalty not guaranteed, but instead earned or bought. Now, at this point, you may be wondering, what exactly happened after the death of Clodomir? After Clodomir's death, his children had been entrusted to their grandmother, Clovis's widow, Clotilde. Now perhaps would be a good time to mention that, through her deeds in life, Clotilde would become a saint in death, in large part because of the instrumental role she played in the conversion of Clovis and the Frankish people to Catholicism. Though she may have unintentionally caused the death of her son by instigating the conflict against the Burgundians in the first place, Clotilde seems to have made up for it by being a loving and dutiful caretaker of her grandchildren. That is, until she was given an ultimatum by her sons, Clotaire and Childebert, who had decided that they would sweep aside their nephews and split their dead brother's lands between them. The pair presented their mother with the scissors and the sword, signifying their intention to have their nephews either tonsured or killed. Clotilde's response to the ultimatum was chilling, even if we give her the benefit of the doubt and suppose that she might have failed in that pivotal moment to realize the weight that her words bore. It is better for me to see them dead rather than shorn, if they are not raised to the kingship, she replied. Whether these words were spoken with quiet malice, or desperation, or unbridled rage, we cannot know for certain. Yet, in uttering them, Clotilde abandoned the grandsons under her protection, just 10 and 7 years old, to her ruthless sons. Clotaire, the youngest of her sons, is said to have performed the deed himself, stabbing both of his nephews to death. This while his older brother Childebert stood by weeping, unable to bring himself to take part in the violence, except perhaps to kill a few nearby tutors and attendants. There was in fact a third nephew, although he managed to escape the scene of the slaughter with the intervention of a few of his followers who had smuggled him to safety. This last nephew had the wherewithal to be tonsured, cutting his long Frankish hair and retiring to a monastery, for which he would be commemorated as a saint after his death. Thus, Clotaire and Childebert had succeeded in their ambition by some of the most vicious means imaginable, partitioning the lands of their dead brother between them, And then, life went on. Clovis's eldest son, Theuderic, had taken part in the fight against the Burgundians and sat out the assassination of his nephews. But in case you think he had any scruples about the ordeal, think again. When it benefited him to do so, Theuderic banded with his brother Clotaire against a different target, the Thuringians in the northeast, who had reneged on a treaty and murdered Frankish hostages. Gregory of Tours tells us that Clovis's eldest son, Theuderic, roused his followers to battle by saying, quote, "The Thuringians murdered our hostages in all sorts of different ways. They attacked our fellow countrymen and stole their possessions. They hung our young men up to die in the trees by the muscles of their thighs. They put more than 200 of our young women to death in the most barbarous way. They tied their arms around the necks of their horses, stampeded these animals in all directions by prodding them with goads, and so tore the girls to pieces. Or else they stretched them over the ruts of their roads, attached their arms and legs to the ground with stakes, and then drove heavily laden carts over them again and again until their bones were all broken and their bodies could be thrown out for the dogs and birds to feed on. What is more, the Thuringian king has now broken his promise to me and refuses utterly to do what he said he would. There is no doubt that we have right on our side. With God's help, we must attack them." End quote. In the lead-up to the decisive engagement of the conflict, the Thuringians dug ditches and covered them up with grass. Unfortunately for them, these traps did little to stop the Frankish cavalry, which surged forward in spite of all danger, lost some of its members, adjusted its course, and cut right through the Thuringian lines, plainly indicating to us just how clever ideas can, at times, crumple in the face of naked force. The conquest of Thuringia yielded not only new lands and riches, but also a wife for Clovis's youngest son, Clotaire, a Thuringian princess named Radegund, who Clotaire and Theuderic fiercely argued over until the former asserted his claim based on the fact that it had been his men who had captured her. Despite that, Clovis's eldest son, Theuderic, was at the height of his glory. And yet, even now, he could not let go of his ultimate ambition to reunite Francia. So while he and his brother Clotaire lingered in their newly conquered Thuringian lands, he plotted to have him assassinated. It had now been 20 years since the start of Theuderic's reign, but despite biding his time for so long, he bungled it. After Clotaire was summoned to his brother's presence, he arrived at a suspicious-seeming courtyard, where he had the wherewithal to spot the feet of his would-be assassins, who were hidden behind a canvas that did not quite reach the ground. This put Clotaire on guard, and we are left to assume that he stuck by his bodyguards and took an alternate path to meet his brother. If there's a lesson to this story, it's that it's always a good idea to be aware of your surroundings, especially if you're a Merovingian king. The story doesn't end there, though. It actually gets better. The scheming Theuderic now had to think up an excuse for why he had summoned his brother Clotaire to his presence. Thinking fast, Theuderic gave him a silver tray that he had lying next to him, but he soon regretted the loss of this precious booty so much that he had his son, Theudebert, ask for it back. And Clotaire, either unsuspecting of this whole ordeal or simply playing along, actually gave the tray back. Meanwhile, Theuderic and Clotaire's brother, Childebert, became embroiled in his own bit of family drama. He had set his sights south, to Spain, where his sister, named Clotilde after their mother, had been married off to the Visigothic king, Amalaric. Despite the practical benefits of an alliance between the Franks and Visigoths, religious differences between Amalaric and Clotilde made the marriage increasingly untenable. Amalaric was a follower of the Arian creed of Christianity, while Clotilde was a Nicene Christian in the tradition of the Merovingian dynasty, respecting the orthodoxy of the Holy Trinity. Supposedly, whenever Clotilde went to church, Amalaric would make sure that she had dung and other filth thrown over her. When tension between the couple reached a fever pitch, Amalaric hit her with such violence that she started bleeding. But Clotilde would have the last laugh. She took a towel stained with her blood and sent it to her brother Childebert. This is purportedly what prompted Childebert's arrival, despite it sounding more like a convenient pretext for more land and wealth for the self-interested Childebert. It would be an easy conquest, since Amalaric quickly opted to escape instead of standing his ground and resisting. But just as Amalaric was about to set off with a fleet of his boats, he remembered that the precious stones he had meant to take on his journey were still locked away in his treasury. Well, as it turned out, that mistake, repeated long into the present day by anyone who's forgotten to turn the stove off before a road trip, would change the course of history. Amalaric decided to head back into the city and retrieve his precious stones, only to find that the way back to the port was blocked once he had recovered them. Having nowhere else to go, Amalaric made a mad dash for a nearby church where he expected to find refuge. But before he could get through the door, one of the warriors hunting him down throws what can only be described as a Hail Mary javelin, guided to its destination in an irreversible act of fate. This left Amalaric mortally wounded, and that was the end of his story. The victorious Childebert then gathered up his troops, his plunder, and his sister, and headed home, only for another plot twist: the sudden and inexplicable death of his sister during the journey home. We hear no more about her, except that she was buried in Paris alongside her father, Clovis. Let us not forget that this was the Middle Ages, when death lurked around every corner, not only in the form of war and violence, but also disease, childbirth, infant mortality, and various other causes. In any case, we don't hear about the specifics, nor do we hear about Childebert mourning the sister he had saved in such a seemingly heroic manner. Instead, the next thing reported to us is that Childebert banded forces with his brother Clotaire to attack Burgundy once again. Their eldest brother, Theuderic, was supposed to have joined them, as he had in the past, but he was concerned about the loyalty of his followers, who made it clear to him that they were not satisfied with the idle spell of peace that had befallen them. Attempting to divert his men's attention without giving them an opportunity to defect to his brothers, Theuderic led them to a different region, Clermont-Ferrand, where they were given free rein to pillage everything in sight. It was one of Theuderic's last recorded acts, for not long after that, he died a natural death and passed his lands to his son, Theudebert, whom we have mentioned already. At this point in time, only two sons of Clovis were still alive, Childebert and his younger brother, Clotaire, the nephew killers. And now they had another nephew, Theudebert, standing in the way of yet more lands and wealth. But unfortunately for them, this wasn't another child they could murder in cold blood. Theudebert was in his prime, a warrior who had already proven himself on the battlefield and supposedly killed the legendary Danish ruler Hygelac of Beowulf fame, when this prototypical Viking warrior king journeyed all the way to Francia to plunder its lands. Theudebert was thus able to fend off both of his uncles, and then managed to turn one against the other. Ultimately, though, the status quo between the three remained in place. Of the many Merovingian rulers who followed Clovis, Gregory of Tours seems to have held Theudebert in high esteem, calling him a great king, distinguished by every virtue. This is despite Theudebert's occasional flashes of pride and lust. This was, after all, the first Merovingian to mint gold coins depicting his own image, rather than a Roman emperor. If that's not vanity, then I don't know what is. Furthermore, like other Merovingians, Theudebert had several wives and concubines, but one of these, the notorious Deuteria, was particularly eager to preserve his waning affections. According to Gregory of Tours, she went to such lengths, in fact, that she supposedly had her own daughter killed in a carefully orchestrated carriage accident. This is because she saw her daughter as a romantic rival for the affections of Theudebert. Like with many of the stories of the Merovingian period, we don't know if this one was an invention or part of a longer story. Whatever the case, though, Theudebert had already been 34 when he ascended the throne, ruling for not quite 15 years before dying prematurely. After being killed by a wild bison he was tracking during a hunting expedition, he left a sickly son on the throne who would die not long